Arizona Territory, late summer noon. Heat hangs like iron over a bone-white arroyo. A broken farm wagon lists on a split axle. One wheel spins idly, clicking like a clock. Vultures skirl overhead. In the wash, a ribbon of quicksand glistens like false water, breathing as it swallows a fallen canteen whole. Willa Lark, 17, orphaned and newly heir to a deeded spring, has been abandoned by her uncle beside the ruined wagon, with her water skin slashed and her horse driven off. He means to claim her father's land by letting the desert finish her. She has hours before the sun, or the men he hired, do what betrayal began. Dusk brings hoofbeats down the arroyo wall, but the rider who appears is no savior. The brand on his horse is her uncle's, and the lariat in his hand was meant for her neck. This tale survives in a sheriff's deposition, where one name was scratched out, an undertaker's ledger that lists unknown Apache, payment in calico, and a parish register misfiled under a false date. Keep watching. You'll see why that single erasure and that misfile changed everything. She tasted metal under her tongue and dust in her teeth and tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry as flint. The sun pushed on her skull like a boot. She was bound at the wrists to the wagon tongue with a strap that smelled of horse and old sweat. The wheel beside her clicked, 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 as if marking time in a language of wood and heat. Her eyes cut to the canteen lying near the lip of the wash. She edged toward it, bracing her heels, dragging the wagon tongue an inch at a time until the strap bit into skin. The canteen rolled. She reached, fingers brushing hot tin. The arroyo floor breathed. The canteen slid forward and sank with a soft gulp, leaving only a smear of dark sand that closed over like a wound. She could hear her uncle's voice, as if he were still there, the easy way he used to say, "girl," instead of her name. He had pressed her shoulder at dawn and told her to sleep as he went to fetch water, leaving her with the wagon and the mare. She had woken with the sun on her face and found the mare's tracks heading away. The water skin cut clean through, the strap around her wrists tight enough to numb her little fingers. She had called once, twice. The land answered with the far gossip of vultures and nothing else. She breathed through her nose and counted. She made herself small in her mind, smaller than the heat, smaller than the fear. When her breath smoothed, she raised her head and looked along the wagon tongue. A rusted bolt stuck up near the axle, like a broken tooth. If she could reach it, if she could fray the strap, if she could keep the panic from boiling up and spilling over. She inched. She rubbed the leather on the tooth of rust. The strap grated. She felt a lick of skin go with it, but she kept sawing, steady as if she were cutting lace for a Sunday dress. Sweat ran down her temple and stung the corner of her eye. She blinked and kept working. A vulture shadow crossed her, slow and patient, as if measuring her for a box. The strap thinned. She jerked hard and felt it give. She scrambled up on her knees and then to her feet, palms braced on the wagon bed. The split axle had punched through the plank. The bed was littered with what they had salvaged after the last bad road: a rifle with a jammed lever, a torn flour sack, an iron skillet, 2 books swollen from heat, and the little cedar box her father had carved with a pocket knife the winter before he took fever. It lay wedged under a folded coat, as if someone had tucked it there to keep it safe. She slid it out, hands shaking now, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded deed sealed with red wax and pressed with a crest, the edges worn soft from being hidden in clothing. Her father's cramped hand named her heir to Lark Spring, the little run that braided out of a rock seam in a side canyon and never ran dry even when the water table sank. She ran her finger over her name. The ink rippled where someone had scored at it with a blade. The date looked wrong by a week. Her father had died on a Saturday that the mission bell tolled twice for, and this paper said otherwise. She felt the wrongness the way you feel a stone in your boot, small, hard, and impossible to ignore. Her throat hitched. She tucked the deed back into her bodice, where the sweat at her sternum would keep the paper warm and soft and close. She looked out across the wash. The far lip shimmered like a line of hot iron. A crow called from the mesquite, harsh and amused. She set her jaw. Hoofbeats tacked down the arroyo wall, slow and sure. She moved behind the broken wheel, heart beating in her throat now. The jammed rifle clutched uselessly by the barrel. The rider came into view, his mount a slab-sided bay with a branded shoulder. Lark burned in neat letters beside a horseshoe mark her uncle used on his employer's stock to make himself feel like an owner. The man's hat brim cut his eyes. He had a coil of rope hanging from his saddle and a grin that looked like it had been whittled from something mean. He glanced at the quicksand and then at her. "Uncle says you're delicate," he said, dismounting. "I'm to help you rest." She didn't feel delicate. She felt her bones like iron bars and the heat like a hammer. She raised the jammed rifle. "Leave," she said. Her voice came out rough but steady. The man laughed. He caught the barrel with 2 fingers, pushed it aside like a stick a child might wave. A single arrow struck the sand at his boot, straight as a rule, feathers quivering. The man jerked back and swore, hand going to the pistol on his hip. Another arrow thudded into the wagon bed near Willa's knee. The man turned toward the mesquite, gun out, eyes narrowed. A figure stepped into the light, lean and spare as a drawn bow. He held his palms open and low in a way that showed he had weapons, but no wish to use them unless forced. His hair fell straight to his shoulders, bound once with rawhide. His shirt was sun-bleached cotton, torn and mended, and a strip of army blue had been patched at one sleeve for strength. He spoke in a low voice that carried without shout. "Go," he said to the hired man. Then to Willa, in halting English, "Move from sand." The hired man fired. The horse flinched and bolted, reins snatching the man off his feet. He stumbled. His boots slid on the pale skin of the wash. The ground sighed. His leg went down to the knee. He screamed and grabbed at the lariat coiled on his saddle. The coil tumbled. He caught a loop and flung it toward a scrub root, missed and flailed. The stranger didn't waste words. He ran low and fast, snatched the end of the rope, fed out slack like a man who had handled wild mustangs and worse, and braced, heels gouged into the firmest ground he could find. "Still," he said to the man, "wide." The hired man thrashed instead, and the sand pulled at him like a mouth. "Don't fight," Willa heard herself say. The man's eyes rolled white. He clawed at the rope until his hands bled. The stranger leaned back, took the pull through his shoulder, and gave ground an inch at a time, drawing the man's leg free with slow, sure pressure. The man came up gasping and cursing, covered to mid-thigh in wet sand. He staggered to his feet and pointed the pistol again, hands shaking so that the muzzle bounced. The stranger's eyes didn't blink. He stood easy, hands low. "No," he said, soft as a prayer, and somehow harder than a shout. A shot cracked from the rim. A second rider, just a shape against the light, levered and fired again. The stranger spun and slammed into Willa, throwing them both down behind the wheel as splinters jumped from the wagon's lip. The hired man ran for his horse, slipping, falling, scrambling up again with one boot squelching. He hauled himself into the saddle and spurred, leaving his coil of rope snaking in the sand. The stranger's breath touched Willa's ear, quick and warm. "More come," he said. "Up." He gripped her arm and pulled her toward the shade under a shelf of rock where the wash had eaten back. It was 10 paces of open glare and the whisper of bullets over stone. She went, feeling the hard shove of adrenaline blot out the heat, the dry, the fear. Under the shelf, the air was a degree kinder. The stranger set her hands on a folded length of cloth and showed her with a gesture to breathe through it. Slow. He tapped the sand with a stick and watched the way it crusted and the way it settled, reading the floor of the wash the way a clerk reads a ledger. He pointed to a line of tiny ants moving toward a seam in the rock and smiled with half his mouth, as if in spite of himself. "Water," he said. "Small. Enough." They waited while the rider on the rim paced his horse back and forth, searching for a clean shot. The sun moved a finger width. The heat pressed, then eased, then pressed again. The stranger crawled to the seam and dug with his hands, packing a little wall of pebbles to hold what seeped. He gave Willa the first palmful, cool and metallic, and so clear, it made her teeth ache. He cupped another drink against his own lip and swallowed without noise. A fly walked the corner of his eye. He didn't move to brush it off. "Why help me?" she asked. Her voice came out like sand rubbing on sand. He looked at her for a beat too long, as if measuring how much to say. "Water is life," he said. "This place, your father, agreement, my kin watch, your kin break. I am Nantan. I guard." The name sat in the air like a true thing. She nodded. "I'm Willa," she said. "Lark." He nodded once as if he had known before she said it. The rider's horse snorted on the rim. The man cursed. Another voice called. Distant. A reply came, farther out. The stranger's mouth tightened. "More," he said. "Night soon." He lifted his chin toward the mesquite. Far off, a smear of smoke rose where none had been. Willa thought of Sundays at the mission, of Sister Magdalene laying a cool hand on fevered cheeks, of the parish register she had once helped dust, the vellum pages heavy as winter. She thought of her father's burial, the bell toll and the dirt on the shovel blade. She thought of the wrong date on the paper inside her dress, and felt a prickle move along her scalp, under her hair, like the lightest touch of electricity. They crawled when the rider's horse turned, and the sun made the cliffs lose their glare for a moment. They kept to the shade when there was shade, and to the hard ground when there was none. The stranger moved as if he had a map in his head, and the map had been drawn by old hands that never trembled. Where the wash narrowed, he showed her how to step. Where the crust held, where it widened into pale powder, he circled to where willow roots made islands. He taught her with 2 words at a time. Soft feet, low breath. Listen, wind. The wind sang one note in the slot of rock ahead, that changed when the angle changed, and he knew when a curve hit a drop. Behind them, hoofbeats multiplied, and then fell away, then multiplied again. Once, they pressed into the dirt as a line of iron-heeled boots marched overhead, the sound of leather creaking, and someone clearing his throat in a way she had already come to hate. "Pike," the stranger whispered, and the name fit the sound. When the sun slid down to the rim and made the air glow like an oven door opened, they reached a rock overhang where a skin of damp hung in the air, and where a man had once laid brush for a blind. The stranger pulled 2 prickly pear pads, singed off the thorns with a twist of burning grass, and cut them into wet slabs that tasted of green and relief. He showed her how ants climb highest, where water lies under the stone. He put her palm on the rock and made her feel the cool pulse that moved under it the way a slow heart moves under ribs. "Your father," he said then, after a long quiet. "He keep word. In lean years, he draw water with us. Not many settlers keep word. Your uncle, he see soldiers, survey, wire fence. He think paper's stronger than rock." He took a breath, and Willa heard something in it, like regret. "Once I was not fast," he said. "Ambush came on boys of our camp. I held back to watch soldiers' flanks. I should have gone sooner. This spring I guard since then." She looked at him. His face held in it a lot of hours and a lot of miles. There was a small puckered scar under his ear, the color of old clay. "I'm sorry," she said, because it was the only honest thing a person could say to that kind of sentence. He nodded and accepted it as if it were a cup of water offered at a gate. Night came, with far thunder that had nothing to do with rain. On 3 ridges, as the light went from gold to bruised blue, little tongues of fire bloomed and flickered and went still. The stranger watched them without speaking. Then an older man appeared at the fringe of the night, his presence like the smell of cedar smoke, there and gone and there again. His hair was white and bound. His face had 1,000 little lines, and the weight of someone who had told stories to keep a camp from going mad with grief. The stranger inclined his head. Willa saw the echo of respect move through his shoulders. The older man said words Willa didn't know, and then words she half knew. He looked at her, not unkindly, but as at a thing the land had blown in. He tapped his chest lightly with knuckles, naming himself in his own language, a name Willa would not repeat because it wasn't hers to say. "Miguel," the stranger said for her, with a dry twist of his mouth. "Settlers might understand." Old Miguel nodded. They spoke of soldiers and surveyors, of pickets set near the spring, of fences rolled out like barbed wire prayers. Old Miguel told a story in a voice like the wind in a tin pipe. He said the spring used to sing louder. He said, when men lie over water, water hides. When truth is spoken, it rises and shows its face. He looked at Willa when he said it, not as accusation, not as kindness, but as a man who places a stone on a scale to see if it balances. She lay that night on a bed of brush that poked her in a constant argument with sleep. She dreamed she was 12 again, sitting at a little mission desk with a feather and ink that smelled of iron, copying names into a book with lines as neat as fence wire. The name she wrote swam, blurred, and slid. A thumb smeared it. She looked up and saw Deputy Silas Pike blow on the page to dry it with breath that smelled faintly of whiskey and wintergreen. He smiled at her, the way a knife might smile in lamplight. She woke with a start to the sound of boot heels printing sand. Iron heel plates make a different music than leather. You can tell a lot about a man by the way his heels sound in the morning. These sounded like men who believed the land would step aside for them. The stranger was already crouched, eyes narrowed, watching the wash. Willa moved her hand to the deed under her dress and felt the crackle of paper like a dry leaf. He motioned for stillness. She held herself like a rabbit holds when the hawk's shadow crosses. Deputy Silas Pike came into view with 2 army scouts. He had a face that looked good in a mirror and a hat pressed too flat. He held a paper that flapped in the hot wind and a voice that held a town's authority like a borrowed suit. Warrant, he said, and the word lay in the air like a stone plunked into a bucket. Trespass and theft of stock, he said, as if reciting a catechism. He didn't see them under the overhang. He turned in place and nodded at the ridges. The scouts spread out in a neat, practiced way. The stranger's head tilted. He listened past the men to something else. Willa heard it then, too. A new set of hoofbeats on the far rim, a horse that had been pushed too hard, breathing loud. She caught a flash of a hat brim she knew before she saw the face. Lucas Lark sat his borrowed authority like a man sits a borrowed chair, careless of breaking it because it isn't his. He smiled down and raised his hand in greeting, deference polite to the deputy. "Morning, Silas," he called, smooth as creek stones. "You found my runaway ward? I've the papers right here, authority signed. A girl can't manage holdings in this territory without the right guidance. I'll take charge and get her safe." He said, safe, the way a wolf says, sheep. Willa put her hand flat on the dirt to keep from flying at him like a striking snake. The stranger's hand landed lightly on her wrist, not restraining, just reminding her of the ground under her and the air in her lungs. Old Miguel stood at the edge of the shade, face unreadable. Sister Magdalene would later say of that moment, in a voice gone hoarse from arguing with men who did not listen, that a girl's heart makes decisions faster than the law can write down. They moved when the heat wobbled the air, and the men turned their faces to the wind. The stranger led them through a slit in the rock that you would miss, unless you had been born under it. They emerged in a pocket, where cottonwood roots braided through stone and made a ladder of sorts, where the air smelled faintly of damp and the memory of green. He showed her how to pull a cottonwood twig and chew the end until fibers splayed and made a brush, then showed her how to scrub sand and blood from her wrist where the strap had chewed. He pressed a little wad of chewed mesquite onto the scrape to keep poison out. He did without fuss what needed doing and left the rest unsaid. They traveled by shade and by the language of ravens and ants. The stranger watched the sky as much as the ground. Willa watched his eyes and tried to see what he saw. Once, they paused because a lizard froze and lifted its head toward the east, listening. Moments later, a train of dust rose in that direction, like breath on cold glass. Soldier. Another time, he touched a flake of flint and knew by its sharpness that other watchers had been here within a day. When afternoon sagged, they came to a hidden camp where women smoked meat and men stripped yucca fibers, where a child chased a dog with a stick and the dog made a game of just nearly catching it. The camp watched Willa arrive the way a body watches a sliver work under skin, attentive, wary, already half irritated. The stranger spoke briefly. One man's mouth tightened. Another woman looked Willa in the eye, and then looked away. Willa felt heat rise under her skin, different from the sun's. She stood her height and folded her hands because her father had once told her that a person's spine speaks first. A little boy coughed in a way that made Willa's bones go cold. It was a cough that echoed from her winters at the mission, the sound of a chest drowning on dry land. Sister Magdalene came then like a small weather change, mule wagon rattling, a crucifix at her throat catching the last light and flinging it back in a flare. She set a pot to boil and crushed leaves with a stone. Willa knelt and held the child steady and spoke low in his ear. Nonsense words and true ones braided. The child vomited and shivered, and then went heavy as sleep. The mother's eyes filled and emptied without spilling. Trust is a thing that moves grain by grain. That night, Willa slept under a mesquite and dreamed of a spring singing under rock. Morning brought a proclamation tacked to the mission door by Captain Edwin Hartley, a man who smelled faintly of soap and iron shavings. He read it out like a Sunday lesson. The Army would hold Lark Spring in reserve pending survey for the common good. He said common good, and looked like he believed it. Lucas stood at his shoulder with a folded smile. Deputy Silas Pike stamped the corner with a seal he carried in his pocket, like a charm. Sister Magdalene drew Willa into the cool dim of the mission for a moment and slid a book out from under a loose board. The parish register lay heavy in her hands, calfskin smooth and cool, despite the heat. She opened to the page where Willa's father's name had been written and laid her finger on the date. The first ink had been watered thin. A second line had been squeezed in with a different hand, a different quill, and a different hurry. "Hush," Sister said, hearing a boot scrape on the porch. "Look only. Remember the smell of the ink. I will not risk leaving this where fools can find it." Willa breathed the tang of iron gall and knew she was smelling a lie dried long ago. Old Miguel told at dusk the story of water diving into earth when men lie and rising when truth is spoken. He looked at the spring as if listening to it hum. The stranger stood near Willa and did not touch her, and she felt braced. Anyway, as if a rope had been tied to a good peg. The camp argued low about what to do. Some wanted to move, some wanted to fight, some wanted to let the land swallow the problem, because the land had more patience than any of them. The stranger listened, and then said nothing for a long time, because saying nothing is sometimes the truest thing a man can do. When the threat of a raid hung like the smell of rain that doesn't come, Willa made her choice. She stepped out where Captain Hartley could see her, and lifted her hands, empty. "I'm Willa Lark," she said, her voice steady, because she made it so. "I'll go with you if you leave them be." Hartley hesitated because he was not a cruel man, only a small one, wearing a big coat. Lucas smiled like a dog that has learned to open a latch. "That's sensible," Lucas said. "Family looks after family." He said, "Family like a rope." The stranger took a step, but before he could say a word, 2 soldiers slid iron around his wrists and pulled it tight enough to bite. "Accomplice," Hartley said, finding the word on a paper and liking how it felt in his mouth. Deputy Silas Pike looked at the stranger, looked at Willa, and then looked at the ground. He stamped another paper and tucked it into his coat. They bumped to town in a wagon that hit every rut twice. Lucas rode beside, talking low to Silas, as if they were swapping recipes. "Signatures are cheaper than bullets," he said once, not low enough, "and both can kill." Willa held the words like a burr under her tongue and kept her face as blank as the side of a jug. The stranger watched the horizon with a calm that was either faith or hollow, and Willa didn't know which until later. Town smelled of dust, sweat, and warm bread. It sounded of hammers and a piano with 3 keys that stuck. Jonah Pike, the undertaker, stood outside his place, in a white shirt that had seen better wash water. He measured the hired man, who had gone under the quicksand with his eyes, and then, with a length of string, he made a box, planed it smooth, and wrote in a ledger with small, neat strokes. "Unknown man, recovered from wash, signet ring noted, not catalog." He paused on the word ring, looked up, and saw Lucas turn a little so as to hide the edge of metal in his vest pocket. Jonah's mouth moved a fraction, not a smile, not a frown, the private language of a man who spends his days sending people to their quiet. Deputy Silas Pike walked Willa to the jail with an odd carefulness that made her want to kick a bucket. He sat at his desk and shuffled papers, like a river shuffles sticks, fast and meaningless. He pulled out a warrant and set it upside down, and then right side up. He cleared his throat 3 times, and then said, "We'll have the hearing quick. No cause for worry." She looked at him, and he couldn't hold her gaze for more than the time it takes to say, "Amen." He looked at his hands, at the grain of the desk, at the fly crawling along the edge of the paper. Then his eyes cut to the door, as if someone might come in to rescue him from himself. A dust squall rose out of nowhere, the way they do, the sky going brown-green, and the air tasting of nickel. The world shrank to the space under the brim of a hat. The stranger sat on the plank floor, iron around his wrists, and leaned back as if he had all the time a man could ever want. When the wind hit its hardest, he twisted his hands in a way that made his wrists look briefly boneless, hooked a bent nail he had pried from the bench edge, and lifted the latch on the cuff. He moved like a man who had taken traps apart for fun in boyhood. He touched Willa's shoulder with a knuckle, and she was up and moving before her mind had caught up. They ran into a wall of grit so thick it made your ears ring. Gunfire snapped in the blindness above, wasted shots that only made men feel less helpless. The stranger pulled Willa into a cut the storm had chewed against the side of the road, a trench that hadn't been there an hour before. That is how the land helps and hinders in the same breath. They belly crawled, ate dirt, and came out behind Jonah Pike's place. Jonah looked at them as they slipped past like cats and said nothing. He glanced once toward the street, where Lucas's hat swam in the dust, like a dark boat. Then he set his pen down and slipped his ledger into a drawer and closed it without a click. They circled out of town by alleys and by the back of the smithy where someone had left a bucket of water, and Willa almost cried at the sight of it. The stranger let her drink slow, counted in a whisper, then took one swallow himself. They moved with the storm at their backs, using it as a blind. By the time the wind fell, their tracks were written over by the land's own rough hand. All roads bent back to water. The stranger didn't waste steps. He took the little ways Willa's father had known with a settler's eyes, and that he himself knew with a different map in his bones. They came over a rise and saw a thread of green darker than the rest of the season's tired palette. Lark Spring lay in a chin of rock, its mouth hidden by a tumble of stones that looked, to the unwary, like just another pile the flood had thrown down. Men don't understand that the land keeps its own counsel. Women too, sometimes. Lucas reached it from the other side with Captain Hartley and Deputy Silas Pike, and a skein of townsmen who came for the smell of a claim. Wire waited on a cart, bright and hungry as a grin. Hartley raised his hand for quiet and began a speech about the common good. Willa heard only the spring, its thin, lovely talk under the words. She stepped closer because her body wanted to be where that sound was. The sky turned the color of brass, and then black, somewhere upriver, that was usually just a sand scar. Rain had come all at once, roaring and thoughtless. A wall of brown water rolled down the arroyo like a beast. That had been woken with a kick. Men shouted, horses panicked, wire toppled into the current and unrolled like a silver snake. Lucas lunged for Willa with the kind of focus a drowning man has for a log. The stranger saw it in the breath before it happened, and moved. He put himself between wolf and lamb, and took the bullet meant for her in the soft meat just under his shoulder. The force of it turned him. He stumbled back. The bank under him went from hard to treacherous in a blink, the skin of it tearing away, as if some invisible mouth had decided it liked the taste of him. He had a rope in his fist, from some old habit of never being without one when there is water. He threw one end to Willa and jerked his chin toward a rock. "Anchor," he said. His face had gone a color Willa never wanted to see again. She tied fast with hands that suddenly remembered every knot her father had ever taught her, the kind that holds and gives Just enough. The kind that makes sense under a storm. The stranger slid to his knees, and then waist. Still, he said, voice a paper's thickness from gone, wide. She heard the lesson you give a panicked horse. She took it. She spread herself on the ground and kept her breathing slow. The flood growled past, tore brush, grabbed at men who grabbed at other men, and pulled them all in a yard where the rules were different. Lucas reached again, stupid with greed and fear, and the bank grabbed him too. His signet ring flashed once. He clawed at the rope, at Willa's ankle, at anything. The stranger, with a sound that was more breath than word, kicked the rope free of Lucas's hand and tightened it around Willa's waist with a twist that made it bite her hips and hold. No, he said, and there was more power in that one soft word than in any gun Hartley had ever ordered fired. The flood took Lucas fast, because greed weighs more than water. The ring's bright circle turned, in the churning, and then winked out as the sand closed over it with the gentle patience the desert saves for men who think it owes them favors. Deputy Silas Pike made a small sound, like a hinge needing oil. He raised his gun and lowered it, and then raised his voice instead. He read from the warrant with a shake in his words he couldn't hide, and then he did a thing he would regret and be proud of in the same minute for the rest of his life. He tore the paper in two and named the wrong date, the scratched name, the payroll stub he had not yet seen, but would. Captain Hartley's order hung, failed to find a throat to latch onto, and died quiet. Willa's hands burned. The rope cut. She pulled. The stranger came up inch by inch out of the quicksand's slow mouth, the grit of it making a sound like teeth. Jonah Pike arrived in the backwash of it all with a cloth he had been saving for his Sunday shirt, and pressed it to the stranger's wound. He said, "Hold," in a voice that had told 100 families. The same thing when holding mattered, and when it didn't. Night came, like a blanket snapped over a crib. Lanterns bobbed. Sister Magdalene's hands were already red up to the wrists when she reached them. She worked with a focus that made foolish men step back. She matched breath with the stranger's and counted without speaking. She pressed calico against the wound, and then more calico, until there was a line in her ledger later that read, "Unknown Apache, payment in calico." Jonah wrote it neat, as he wrote everything, because neatness is the only defiance some men ever get to make. Willa sat on a stone with her braid sticking to her neck, and the deed damp against her skin, and felt the spring's voice low and sure. She did not cry. She did not sleep. She listened. Somewhere under the rock, she thought she heard the water change its tune for one heartbeat, and old Miguel, standing with his hands behind his back, like a man at a grave, nodded once in the same moment, as if whatever they had both heard was true enough to hold. At dawn, after a night that felt like a year, she went back to the wagon they had fled, and cut open the saddlebag the hired man had left when he ran. Paper rasped inside like dead moths. She pulled a folded sheet that smelled of sweat and oiled leather. It was a payroll stub signed in Lucas Lark's hand, paying men for escort service rendered, and miscellaneous removal, the words smooth as mud. Beneath it, another deed lay, neat as a lie, naming Lucas Lark guardian of a minor ward, property to pass to his hand upon demise. The seal on it matched the crest Sister Magdalene would later trace with her fingertip. Willa looked up at the morning and felt something in her settle into place like a brick in a chimney. In the sheriff's deposition, one line was erased. The narrator would later tell anyone who would listen, voice low, the way one speaks, in a room where the dead are laid out. Next you will hear the words they tried to destroy. She folded the deceit and the proof and tucked both into her dress, where true things and dangerous things must sometimes live together. She walked back to the spring with the papers warm against her ribs, and the sun just sliding its first blade over the canyon rim. The ground felt new scrubbed after the flood, scoured clean in places and rearranged in others. Branches lay in tangled rafts where water had pressed them, and the smell of wet earth still clung to the stones. Sister Magdalene sat on a flat rock, with her sleeves rolled and her hands quiet, for the first time in hours. The stranger, Nantan, dozed under a blanket, his breath thin but even, his skin gone the color of dust. At dusk, Jonah Pike had laid out his instruments on a cloth and was rinsing them in boiled water he had brought in a kettle meant for tea. He nodded at Willa, as if she were a widow, arranging a wake instead of a girl who had pulled a man out of the mouth of the earth. She knelt beside Nantan. His eyelids twitched and then opened. He watched her face as if seeing where he had landed. "You stayed," he said. It came out more like a thought than a question. She showed him the folded sheets by lifting the edge of her dress and letting him see the corner. "Paper," he said with the faintest curl of a smile. "You keep strong paper." She almost laughed at that because it was true. She felt stronger for having them, as if ink could stiffen a spine when it mattered. Old Miguel stood at the lip of the spring, with his hands behind his back, watching the water, the way a man watches a sleeping child, ready to move at the first wrong sigh. He turned his head slightly as Willa rose and came to him. "The ring?" he asked, in English that kept the cadence of his own tongue. She shook her head. "The land kept it," she said. "Good," he said, and there was a hard piece in that one word. "Some metal sings wrong. Better it sleeps." Captain Hartley arrived before the sun had cleared the rim. He came with 6 soldiers and a surveyor with a chain and a book. He stopped a respectful distance from Sister Magdalene because even a man in a big coat understands a nun's space. "We need this spring marked for the common good," he said, repeating the sentence that had felt so solid in his mouth yesterday and had felt less so after ink tore in Deputy Pike's hands. "We will fence it and allot access." He glanced at Willa then, and at Nantan, and the words dried a little. "If there is a claim," he added, "we will settle it in town." Willa stepped forward with the calm weight of a person who has decided to carry her fear in both hands instead of letting it carry her. "There is a claim," she said. She pulled the payroll stub and the false guardianship from her dress and held them out to Jonah first, not Hartley, because Jonah would read them and remember. Jonah lifted his brows a hair's breadth and smoothed the paper with fingers that had smoothed shrouds. He read each word twice. Then he turned the pages toward Hartley and let the officer see there were letters on them that would not fall off when stared at. Hartley took a long breath. "Mr. Lark?" he asked out of habit, looking around as if Lucas might step from behind a rock with his hat tilted and his smile pinned on. "Gone," Jonah said, without heat. He did not add that the land had spoken and taken its fee. "This woman," Sister Magdalene said, touching Willa's arm, "is no ward. She is an heir, and the date on the first deed is wrong by a week." She said it like she was teaching a child, the simplest sums. The surveyor fidgeted, the chain clinking soft as a charm bracelet. "Orders are orders," he muttered. Old Miguel watched him, not unkindly, only as a man watches a snake that is more scared than dangerous. "What is ordered wrong should be disordered," Old Miguel said, and if his English made a crooked path, the sense got there just the same. Deputy Silas Pike rode, up with his hat brim low, his posture careful. He had the look of a man who knows a card is under the table and does not yet know how to bring it up without showing his own hand first. He dismounted and nodded to Hartley, a shade too polite. "Sir," he said. Hartley nodded back, eyes narrowed. "We will convene at noon," Hartley said, falling back on the comfort of clocks and benches and rooms with doors. "The sheriff will take testimony. The papers will be examined." He looked at Willa again. "Bring the deeds," he said. "I will bring the proclamation," he added, as if that would even the scale. Willa looked at him, and then at the spring. "I will bring what is mine," she said. Hartley did not miss the shape of that answer, and did not like it much. He turned his horse, and the men followed, the surveyor carrying his chain, like a penitent bears a cross. When they were gone, old Miguel let out a breath he had been holding for 3 sentences. He looked at Nantan. "You move?" he asked. Nantan set his jaw and propped himself up on an elbow. "I walk," he said, and tried. Pain rode him and bucked him. Sister Magdalene pushed him back with a hand that was gentle and immovable. "You will walk when walking keeps you alive," she said. "Not before." Jonah folded his cloth slow as thought. "I am going to town," he said, as if mentioning he was going to draw water. "There is a ledger wants straightening." Willa touched his sleeve. "The Undertaker's book," she said. He nodded. "It remembers what men forget," he said, and then he was already halfway to his horse. Willa stayed until Nantan slept again, a thin sleep that looked like it could blow away if a loud voice passed too near. She tucked the deed closer and started for the mission, with Sister Magdalene and old Miguel walking a little behind and to either side, the way two old dogs flank a child on a road with strangers. The mission's whitewashed wall bit into the sunlight and threw it back. In the cool dim of the nave, the air tasted of candle smoke and lemon oil. Sister Magdalene slid the register out from under the loose board and set it on the little sacristy table like a loaf, set for blessing. Willa opened to her father's page. There it lay, the line of his name, the little cross beside it, the date that wanted to be true and was not. In the margin was the ghost of another hand, diluted, rubbed. She could see the space where a name had been and then not been. The paper thinned there like skin over a sharp bone. She could smell the ink as if it had just been laid down. The wrongness fit with the wrong in her deed and the wrong in Silas's torn warrant, and together they made a shape. She ran her finger just above the lines, not touching, because Sister Magdalene had taught her to love books as living things. "Who did this?" she asked. "A hand that thinks it can hide from God," Sister said, "and from women who keep records," she added, dry as desert humor. Boots scraped on the mission step. The register slid back under the floor with a soft whisper. Hartley entered with Silas, and a man Willa did not know, a clerk with hair slicked flat, a tin of ink in his hand, and a lips-pressed smile. "We will take sworn statements," Hartley said. "The sheriff will come shortly." Sister Magdalene did not bow, but she inclined her head a fraction, enough to keep the peace inside her own walls. Silas's mouth moved, as if chewing words before trying them. He looked at Willa. "Miss Lark," he said. He had never called her that before. "Your uncle's body." He stopped. The word hung for a beat. He had not called Lucas a body yet, not even in his own head. "Was not recovered," he finished, the way a man finishes a prayer he cannot feel. "Mr. Pike has made an entry." Willa pictured the neat line, "Unknown man, recovered from wash, signet ring noted, not catalogued." She pictured the ring sleeping in the sand, the crest on it matching the pressed seal on her deed. "It is enough," she said, not to Silas, not to Hartley, but to the ledgers that bind the world. The sheriff entered at last, a big man with a bellows chest and eyes that had seen too much and not enough. He sat, creaked, and gestured. "We'll hear it," he said. Hartley began with order and surveys. Willa spoke after, slow and clean. She laid the first deed on the table and traced the wrong date with a fingernail. She laid the payroll stub and the guardianship. Silas watched her hand and flinched when it moved over the word demise. Sister Magdalene did not bring the register, but she said its truth plain, and the sheriff squinted, as if looking into glare, and believing anyway, because the shape of it fit what his bones knew about his deputy, about Lucas, about the way men use paper, like they use rope. The clerk with slick hair made little sounds of disapproval, the way a small dog barks behind a fence. The sheriff banged the heel of his hand on the table, and the sounds stopped. A boy burst in, panting, wide-eyed. "Soldiers on the ridge," he blurted. "Wire carts. Survey stakes." Hartley stood too fast and knocked the chair back. "No one is to touch that spring until the claim is settled," he said. But even as he spoke, his face told him his voice would not carry fast enough across the land. They spilled out into heat like men roll dice, frantic, hoping for favor. Willa ran with them, feet slapping dust, her breath counting her steps. The spring lay ahead, a small mouth in stone, with a voice too thin to carry far, and yet it had drawn everyone like a bell. The surveyor had his chain out and his stakes ready. A soldier held a hammer. Two ranch hands Willa did not know held wire and looked pleased to have something to do that felt like winning. Old Miguel stepped between the soldier and the mouth of the spring with a stillness that was not bluff. He stood like a cottonwood, roots sunk, arms by his sides, eyes watching the hammer, the man, the chain, the water, all at once. "Do not," he said. The soldier hesitated because his training had taught him to measure distance and weight, and he had no measure for this. The surveyor cleared his throat. "By order," he began, and then stopped because Willa had stepped up too, papers in her fist, and Sister Magdalene stood at her shoulder, and Silas Pike stood at her other, and Hartley was there with his hat in his hand for once. And suddenly the soldier was no longer a soldier, but a boy, with a hammer surrounded by people who were not going to move. From the far side of the wash, 2 horses appeared with men on them, Willa recognized, with a small twist in her gut. They were not Lucas's men. They were men he had paid once, and who did not like to lose a wage because the payer had gone into the earth without settling accounts. Their faces were wrong, with drink and heat, and not enough sleep. One had a scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The other had hands like paddles, and a quiet that made Willa nervous. They did not come for law. They came for debt. "Ward's claim is void," the sneer mouth called. "Guardian gone. Land up for taking." He said it, as if saying it would make it right. Silas Pike moved his hand toward his gun, and then stopped, because his hand remembered the paper it had torn, and did not want to shoot the people his own conscience had just chosen. Hartley called for calm, and sounded like a man asking a storm to wait. Willa shifted her feet to better ground, because she had learned in one day what most people learn in a year. Where you stand decides how long you stand. Nantan came then, slower than a healthy man, and steady as a good post. He had bound his shoulder tight with a strip of calico and a piece of clean leather Sister Magdalene had cut from a saddlebag donated to the mission by a woman who would not ride again. He was pale under his skin, and his mouth was a hard line. He walked to the edge of the spring and faced the 2 debt men with that particular kind of quiet that makes bullies think about their mothers. Sneermouth laughed, too loud. "Look at the hero," he said, bleeding for a puddle. Nantan did not look at him. He looked at the water. "Not puddle," he said. "Life." Old Miguel's head turned a fraction, the way a teacher's turns when a student speaks the right answer without looking at his notes. The hammerman decided to decide. He lifted his arm. Willa took 1 step forward and laid the wrong-dated deed on the stone, flat as bread on a hot griddle. "Set your stake through my father's name," she said. The soldier's mouth opened and closed. He lowered the hammer. "Ma'am," he said, because sometimes a boy is raised right. The debt men did not stop. They swung down off their horses, tied quick, and came on like a promise of trouble. The one with paddle hands had a length of chain wrapped around his fist. The sneer mouth kept one hand near his belt, where a knife handle showed, worn smooth by fingers. They were not here for the spring at all. They were here to make a point on someone's face. Willa felt her throat tighten, and then go dry, and then go clear, like a creek after silt falls. "Silas," she said low. "Choose." He heard his name as it comes from a pulpit. He drew his gun, not fast, not slow, and laid it across his forearm like a man who shoots to stop, not to kill. "Enough," he said, and his voice carried finally, perhaps because he said the word first to himself and then to the world. The sneer mouth lunged anyway. It happens like that. The body does not always serve the better thought. Nantan stepped sideways, and the chain fist slid past his shoulder. He turned the man with a hand to the elbow, the way you turn a reluctant mule, used his own weight, and the man's, to send him stumbling toward the sand where the bank had softened. Paddle hands swung. Old Miguel hit the wrist with a stick he had been using as a walking staff. Bones make a hollow pop when struck right. The chain fell. Hartley shouted. The soldiers finally remembered they were soldiers. The surveyor used his chain like a whip and looked amazed when it worked. It was a flurry then, brief and messy. One of the debt men found himself staring up at the sky, with his breath gone. The other landed on his knees and wondered how he had come to be holding sand instead of plans. Silas did not fire. He held steady, orders half formed in his mouth, and when it was over, he lowered the gun and felt the weight of it for the first time. A whistle cried from the ridge. Another group crested. A half-dozen riders from the ranch that paid Lucas, faces blank and eyes bright. They saw the wire, The stakes, the nun, the army, the Apache, the girl, the undertaker's horse in the distance, the elder, and they understood only one thing. Power was loosely held here, and they could pull, if they wished. Back, Hartley said, but his voice now had to travel farther and against wind. Willa stepped to the spring and heard it as if it had moved closer to her ear. She knew in that breath the story old Miguel had told was not a pretty lie. She thought of names. She thought of ink. She thought of a ring caught in sand and a ledger with 2 lines written in steady hand. She thought of a boy's cough in a camp and the way Sister Magdalene's fingers had steadied it. She thought of Nantan's eyes on the water. She lifted the false guardianship and held it high. "This paper is a lie," she said, "and the land will not drink lies." She looked at Silas. "Say the name you scratched," she said. The world held still enough to hear ants talk. Silas's mouth worked. He looked at Hartley and at the sheriff and at Willa and at his own hand. "Lucas Lark," he said, and the saying took something from him and gave him something back at the same time. "I erased his name to keep the peace," he said, voice low, "and made war inside myself instead." The riders from the ranch twitched in their saddles like men waiting for a cue. The cue came not from a man, but from the sky. Thunder that had been far decided to step closer. The wind shifted. The smell of rain came on it, true this time, not just talk. The arroyo above them, empty a blink ago, sent a thin, dark line toward them that thickened as they watched. Flood again. The land had not finished speaking. Hartley saw it and understood that law would be washed meaningless if they stayed here one more minute reading papers. To a river. "Fall back," he shouted. "Everyone off the wash." The ranch riders cursed because they did not like to obey any voice, not wearing their own hat. Old Miguel moved without hurry to where the spring's mouth sat higher than the wash. He placed himself there again, and Willa found herself beside him, and Nantan, against Sister Magdalene's order, came one step nearer, teeth clenched. Silas took Willa's elbow to pull her back, and then let go because he remembered her telling him to choose, and he had, and it meant standing where she stood when it mattered. Water came. It was not the wall of brown that had taken Lucas. It was a hard, fast sluice that could sweep a man's feet if he pretended not to respect it. It tore the surveyor's stakes out and spun them like straws. It lifted the coil of wire and took it 20 yards and dropped it against a rock like a broken idea. It made the debt-men scrabble back, mouths full of mud curses. It did not touch the spring. The water at the mouth rose a finger width, sang a different note for one clear second, and then settled, stubborn as truth. The men on the ridge pulled their horses around and shouted and scattered, because floods and bullets both demand swift choices, and only one of them can be argued with. Hartley, soaked to the knee and startled into honesty, looked at Willa across the strip of running water. He opened his mouth, shut it, and then opened it again. "We convene at noon," he said, but softer, as if he knew the judge there would not be only him. "Bring your papers. Bring your witness. I'll bring mine." He gathered his men and went, boots sucking at the mud. Willa watched him go and felt the shape of the day to come settle over her like a cloak she had not asked for and could not shrug off. She looked at Nantan. Sweat stood on his lip. His shoulder bled through clean calico gone rust at the center. "Sit," she said. He sat. Jonah Pike returned then from town, with his ledger under his arm, and his shirt damp with a rain that had not yet reached the spring. He had a look on his face like a quiet man who has just broken a simple rule and expects to be fined by his own conscience for it. "I did not catalog the ring," he said to no one in particular. "Some things belong to the earth." He set the ledger on a rock and flipped it open to the page with the 2 neat lines. He added a note in the margin, very small. "Witnessed storm. Fence not raised." He blotted it. He looked pleased by the balance of it. Sister Magdalene put a hand on Willa's shoulder and squeezed once, the way a person tests a rope before trusting it with weight. "We will need the register," Willa said. Sister nodded. "The board under the altar is loose," she said. "Loose things are useful." Silas lingered, as if his feet had forgotten how to choose a direction without asking his heart first. The sheriff will not like how Noon feels, he said. He will like it less if I speak before he does. Willa looked at him. Speak anyway, she said. He nodded, the way a child nods when a chore is named, that he will do and not enjoy. They set out together. Willa, Sister Magdalene, Silas, Jonah with the ledger, and a boy from the camp who could run faster than anyone else and carry messages between worlds. Old Miguel stayed, keeper, at the spring mouth. Nantan watched them go and closed his eyes and breathed slow, so his blood would stay where it belonged. The sky stacked rain to the south. The wind braided dust at their ankles and then unbraided it again. The street outside the sheriff's office looked like a stage before the curtain goes up. Men in clumps, women at doors, boys climbing anything that would bear them, dogs under wagons. The piano in the saloon hit 3 sour notes and then stopped as the player leaned to see. Hartley stood near the door with the surveyor and 2 soldiers. The ranch riders hung back like vultures waiting to see which thing would die. The clerk with slick hair had 2 pens in his vest like weapons. Inside, the room was hot. The sheriff sat with a fan he did not use. He gestured to the table. Well, he said, making a whole barrel of meaning out of one word. Willa laid the papers out like cards. Jonah set his ledger beside them like a stone beside bread. Sister Magdalene spoke first, this time, because someone had to name the altar without naming it. The register shows a date the army will find useful, if it wishes to keep its honor, she said, and a smear where a man tried to move God's hand. Hartley's jaw tightened. Sister, he began. She lifted one finger and he stopped. You may have your law, she said. I will have my truth. Silas cleared his throat. He took out a folded paper and laid it down, eyes on his hands. This is the deposition, he said. The line you see scraped was my scraping. I was asked to make the name less clear. He looked up at Hartley then, and at the same time at the clerk, and the same time at the empty space where Lucas would have smirked if he had not been learning the language of sand. I was asked by a man now dead, Silas said, and the room let out a breath it had not known it had been holding. I did it to keep fists off faces. It put fists inside me. I am done with that. The sheriff watched his deputy while, chewing the memory of 1,000 small favors. We'll set it right, he said at last. Not loud, and because he rarely promised anything, the promise landed with weight. Hartley nodded once. A man ceding ground he could not stand on any longer. I will report the reserve delayed pending review, he said, and the clerk made a noise like a knife disapproving of a whetstone. You will report what happened, Sister Magdalene said, and it wasn't a question. There was a thud outside, then a high voice. The boy from the camp skidded in with dust from the ridge on his ankles. Riders, he panted, 10, maybe 12, from the big ranch, with chains. Silas's gun was in his hand before he knew it. Hartley reached for his hat. Jonah closed his ledger with care and tucked it under his arm, as if preparing it for travel. Willa felt the world tilt toward the spring again, as if the town itself were a bowl, and the water, the one true center everything rolled toward when shaken. They went out into hard light. The riders came down the main road in a push, faces flat with intent, chains looped over saddles like vipers sunning. The lead man wore a coat too fine and boots too clean, which meant he had money and wanted to remind everyone of it. He smiled at Hartley and at the sheriff, and then let his gaze slide over Willa, as if she were the broom a bar girl leans on, not the person holding the deed that could strip his men of their day's entertainment. We're here to secure resources, he said, stealing Hartley's words and making them ugly. You folks had your meeting. We're having ours at the spring. Hartley stepped into the road. Stand down, he said. The man's smile did not move. I don't take orders from coats, he said. The ranch riders moved around Hartley like water splits around a rock. Silas and the sheriff blocked as many as they could, but some slid past down the alley and cut for the wash. Sister Magdalene looked at Willa. Choose, she said, not unkind. Willa chose. She ran toward the spring. The boy from the camp ran beside her, feet barely touching ground. Jonah followed at a steady pace, not fast, never hurried, and somehow always in the right place when needed. Hartley swore once. Low, A good honest word that took some of the starch out of him, and then he ran too. Because nothing fixes a mistake like the next right thing done at speed. The sun dropped a degree. The wind tasted of rain again, strong now. The spring waited. Old Miguel stood where he had been, body a line between hammer and mouth of stone. Nantan rose when he saw the dust, and braced himself on his good arm. He looked at Willa as she came, saw the riders sweeping like crows, counted them, counted the rifles, counted the breaths he had left that would hold steady for a shot if it came to that. He picked up the rope that had saved a life and looped it once around his hand. The riders fanned out. Chains swung and sang. One voice shouted. Another laughed. The ground under their horses had been packed hard by 100 thirsty days. The wash glittered where water had sanded it smooth that morning. It would not take much to make it treacherous again. Willa looked down at the spring, and then up at the riders, and then at Silas, who had reached her side with his gun out and his mouth set. "Tell me where to stand," he said, and she pointed. He went and planted his boots and stopped thinking about everything except the space between his barrel and the first man's hand. The lead rider raised his chin. "Last chance," he said. A low growl rolled from the sky, answering a threat men had not finished making. Willa felt the page of the day flip. "In the Undertaker's bill," the narrator would say later, "there's a charge no one could explain. Next you will learn who paid it and why." The riders kicked their horses. The horses hesitated because horses know more than men about where to put a foot. Then, pushed, they surged anyway. The first set of hooves hit the edge of the wash and skated. The second set found purchase. The third set slipped for real. Chains lifted. Guns came up. Nantan wound the rope around a post old Miguel had anchored a decade before, for reasons no one argued about then, and everyone understood now. The riders fanned across the wash with chains swinging like bad intentions given weight, and the ground under them answered with a slick that had not been there a breath before. The first horse stepped and skated. The second planted and then slithered a half pace. The lead man laughed to show he was not afraid, and that laugh snapped something thin and invisible that had been holding his men's sense together. Guns lifted. The air tightened. Nantan took the rope and threw a loop around the post old Miguel had set years ago, cinched it with a twist, and braced. "Wide," he said, the word for Willa as much as for the horse he would pull if it fell. Silas stood where she had pointed, feet in a V, gun steady, eyes on hands, not faces. Hartley took one step forward and then stopped, because a man cannot wade into a thing if he does not yet know which way the current runs. The first chain whistled and flashed. Old Miguel let it pass and brought his stick down on the man's wrist with a pop like a knuckle cracking. The chain fell and bit the man's boot, and in the stagger he made, his horse sat back and slid. Willa felt her heel dig into rock that did not give. She felt the spring at her left whisper, as if telling an old story to a child who will finally hear it right. The rider to the right flung a rope meant for Willa's shoulders. Nantan snapped his loop up and caught the rope at midair, twisted it, and yanked. The force pulled the man's hand down, and his balance with it. He toppled toward the wash, hit the skin of wet sand with both knees, and sank an inch like a man trying a bed too soft. Gunfire cracked. A chip of stone grazed Willa's cheek and burned. Sister Magdalene put a hand between Willa and the spring without looking at the bullets, as if her body had always known it would be used this way. Silas fired once, low, and hit a chain to shock a man's fingers open, and that small mercy made the man curse and back his horse, because being humbled is a kind of pain. Some men feel longer than they feel a wound. The lead rider kicked hard and came straight for Willa because he thought, that is how you win a day, by putting your horse where a girl stands. The horse, God bless it, had its own ideas. It planted one forefoot on the thin crust at the wash edge, felt it give, and leaped sideways. The rider slid. His boot stuck. The horse jerked free and the boot came off, and he hit the sand in his sock with a sound like wet cloth. "Still," Nantan called, because he cannot help trying to save even a fool. But the man thrashed, and the wash took his other foot and he went into the calf, and then to the knee. He screamed the way a stuck hog screams, high and full of outrage that the world would treat him like any other animal. Another rider raised a rifle and drew a bead on Silas's back. Willa saw the line of it. Her mouth moved before her legs did. "Left," she said, and Silas shifted a breath sooner than a bullet, and the shot tore his sleeve instead of his lung. He turned and shot the rifle clean out of the rider's hands, and the man stared at his empty fingers like a baby surprised by air. Hartley shouted something that was half a command and half a prayer. The soldiers remembered their training and formed a line, and their line meant little against water, but much against men who liked to run as a pack. Rain spit and then fell for real. It hit the dust and turned it into paste. It ran in thin snakes down rocks and pooled at the wash edge and seeped into sand already full, and made it treacherous where it had pretended to be kind a moment earlier. Nantan's wound opened warm under his bandage, and he did not look at it. He pulled on the rope. Willa took a wrap of it around her wrist and leaned back with all the weight in her little body, eyes on the knot, mouth set, breath counting. The stuck rider howled and grabbed the loop as if a thing made of hemp could be a mother's hand. "Still," Nantan said again. The man obeyed, not because he heard the word, but because exhaustion is a teacher louder than any voice. Paddle hands came with a knife aimed low for Nantan's gut, because cowards stab low. Nantan turned and caught the wrist. Pain flared across his face like summer lightning, bright and gone. He twisted the knife hand outward, used the man's own shoulder against him, and took the knife clean. He flipped it and drove the blade into the mud at the man's knee, pinning his pants to ground that would not hold him anyway. The knife would be found a day later by a boy with quick eyes and kept for 20 years, and then traded for a goat, and so on, because tools live longer than men and carry their stories without caring. The lead rider came free and scrambled up, sock black with wet grit. His face went red with the shame of having begged rope from the very people he had meant to chain. He yanked a pistol and fired toward Willa, because shame makes a poor aim mean. Nantan moved without thinking. He put his body between, and the bullet found what bodies offer when they are asked to keep a promise. It hit high this time, near where the first had bruised and torn. The force turned him. He took 2 steps backward, and his heel broke the thin crust at the edge of the wash. The earth under him sighed, and then opened its small, slow mouth. He sank to the ankle, then to the shin. Willa's throat made a sound she did not recognize. She lunged toward him and felt the ground shift under her own weight. He held a hand out, palm up, the way he had stepped from mesquite with open hands the first day. "No," he said, gentle and hard together. "Rope." She threw the loop and missed, and threw again, and caught his shoulder under the arm, and pulled the knot tight with a jerk that burned her palm. He wrapped the free end around his forearm, rolled his body to make his chest broad to the pull, and looked at her once, as if memorizing something small, the way her hair stuck to her forehead, the dust line on her cheek where the chip of stone had kissed her, the way her jaw set when she chose a thing. Silas fired again, not at a man this time, but at a chain that had found Sister Magdalene's skirt. The chain jumped, and the sister stepped free like a dancer. Hartley waded into the wash to grab the bridle of a horse that had foamed with panic. He crooned nonsense like a nurse. The sheriff knocked the lead rider flat with the flat of his hand. Old Miguel stood where he had taken his first stand, and did not budge, and looked for a heartbeat, like a younger man, because purpose takes years off if you let it. The wash took a breath, and then another. It tugged at Nantan's legs, as if testing a knot. He looked down, as if considering whether to scold the water or ask it a favor. He looked up and chose to speak to Willa instead. "If I go," he said, and she shook her head hard like a child, told her father will not return. "If," he said again, soft and immovable. "Listen, share water. Your father kept word. Keep. When men come with paper, you show them rock. When men come with guns, you show them names. When your breath is small, make it wide." He managed a poor smile. "Like rope." He set his heel against a stone under the surface and pushed, and the effort cut a line of pain across his mouth. And still he pushed, because some men die with their feet planted, and it is a beautiful stubbornness to see. Willa and Silas both hauled. The rope burned Willa's skin and cut Silas's palm, and neither let go because pain has no meaning when you are pulling a measure of a man upward against the earth's slow hunger. Nantan came up to the knee and stopped. The wash tugged again, because the land is patient and does not tire of asking. The led rider, wild with rage and shame and the fear of losing before the boys, raised his pistol one more time. Silas saw the angle and knew he could not bring the barrel around in time. Willa saw only a small bright circle and the eye behind it like a penny in a puddle. Old Miguel moved a step left and lifted his stick. Sister Magdalene shouted a word that could have been any name. The shot cracked. Nantan jerked as if a string had been pulled. The rope jumped in their hands. He grabbed it with both fists and held, eyes on Willa, mouth set the way hers set. Still, he whispered, hers to remember, not his to use anymore. The wash took his feet from under him with a grace that was almost kind. He went forward onto his chest, hung a breath in the rope, and then the pull slid through his weight, and he was gone under, and the rope came up empty, wet, and light. There was no sound for 3 heartbeats. The rain tapped, the spring whispered, a horse blew. Willa stood with the rope in her hands and knew she would feel its rasp for the rest of her days. Down to mornings when she woke and reached for a cup. She stepped forward a half step, and the ground warned her with a slick slide. She stepped back because she had promised without words to keep breathing if he could not. The riders broke then, because men like that do not know how to stand still in the face of a thing that does not fear them. The sheriff shouted them off with a voice he had not used in years. Hartley leveled his orders like a plank. The soldiers finally made a wall worth the name. The ranch hands pulled their men out by collars and curses. Chains trailed. A boot was left behind like a snakeskin. Rain softened everything. Willa knelt and pressed the deed to the stone by the spring. She laid her palm over it and closed her eyes. She was not praying to the God in the mission or to the old gods in the rocks. She was praying to the stubbornness in men like her father and Nantan and old Miguel and Sister Magdalene. She opened her eyes and stood and looked at Silas. He looked older and cleaner. "Write it true," she said. He nodded once and knew exactly what it was. They built a cairn at dawn. They did not find a body. The cairn was not emptier for that. Old Miguel placed the first stone, flat and broad, and spoke half in his tongue and half in Willa's. Words that did not translate into anything but the feeling of someone being carried properly from this world to wherever brave water flows, under better sky. Sister Magdalene laid a strip of clean calico under the top stone. She had cut it herself and marked one corner with a cross thread in blue. Willa set the deed on the cairn like a wing and then took it back, because paper belongs on flesh when the fight is not done. Jonah Pike stood with his hat in his hands and a pencil behind his ear. He wrote later in the eye, "Neatest hand the town had. Unknown Apache. Flesh wound. Bled long. Payment in calico." He added a second line smaller. "Pine box carried to spring at nightfall. Returned unused." He did not say who had paid for the box that did not carry a body. In the sheriff's deposition, the words would sit quiet. Deputy Silas Pike, remits fee. If you read the undertaker's bill, you will find a charge nobody could explain for lantern oil at the spring, settled in coin, wrapped in paper with no signature. That line matters. Now you know who paid it and why. At noon, they met again in the hot room that smelled of ink and men. Sister Magdalene laid the parish register open to the page with the wrong date and the thin rub, and told the sheriff where to set his finger. He did not touch, because his hands were not clean enough for that book. But he looked. Hartley set the army proclamation aside with a sigh, as if it were a glove he would not wear again. The clerk with slick hair sharpened a pen no one would hand him. Silas spoke his own name, the way a man introduces a stranger he has decided to be. He said Lucas's name and did not lower his voice. He placed on the table the payroll stub and the false guardianship and the warrant with the scraped line. He said the words that had been erased. The room did not break with applause. It settled, as if a cart had been leveled. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Lark owns water by right of deed, and by right of witness," he said. "The spring is not to be fenced." He looked at Hartley. "You can post the common good somewhere else." Hartley nodded, tired to the bones. "We will note this spring as shared resource per prior agreement," he said, surprising himself by how right that sounded in his mouth. Old Miguel stood in the doorway and heard the words and gave the smallest nod a man can give and still mean it. Willa felt her knees threaten to give and did not let them. She wanted to sit in the dust and cry and laugh and sleep for a year. Instead, she folded the deed and slid it into her dress and stood, because standing is how you hold a thing after you win it. That evening, the spring sang louder. Willa could hear it without putting her ear to rock. The camp came to drink as they had before the fear. Women filled pots and smiled without showing teeth. A child held a rag doll and did not cough. Sister Magdalene washed her hands in a bowl and poured the water back into the ground. Old Miguel told a story that began with a coyote and ended with a crow and had the spring in the middle. Hartley rode up without soldiers and tipped his hat to no one in particular and sat on his horse and watched the light catch on the water and did not speak. Silas came on foot with his hat in his hand and laid it on the stone and stood a minute and took it back, and that was his prayer. Jonah brought his ledger, and after looking around like a man checking a stove, wrote one more small line under the others. Fence. Withdrawn. Agreement spoken at water's mouth. He underlined spoken because some words earn their lines. Willa walked the line of cottonwoods that had survived the flood and found Nantan's blood on a leaf, gone dark and dry. She pinched the leaf and held it until it crumbled and fell and mixed with dust that had been other men and women. She set small stones in a pocket near the cairn where children could leave feathers if they wished. She touched the rope burn on her wrist and counted the beats of the spring with her fingers. Days later, 2 men came from the county with a fresh sheet for the sheriff's book and a little pot of new ink. They asked their questions and got fewer answers than they wanted. Willa spoke when she chose. Sister Magdalene looked at them as a mother looks at boys who have built a fort where the laundry should line. Old Miguel said nothing to them at all and still sent them away full of news. Silas took their paper, wrote true, and signed his name without his hand shaking. Hartley stamped the margin with a seal that did not erase anything. At dusk, Willa carried the deed to the cairn and laid it there, because sometimes you must put a thing down and trust it will not blow away. She sat on the stone, skirt catching dust, and watched the sky turn the color of a bruise and then of a prayer shawl. A coyote yipped. A hawk rode a slow curve. The spring lifted one silver thread of water and let it fall, showing its face the way old Miguel had said it might when truth stood on both banks. Willa touched the deed once and took it back and pressed it to her chest. "I will keep it," she said, and the land, being what it is, did not answer with words, but with a coolness in the air that could have been agreement. Before she slept that night, she lit 2 candles at the spring, set them on flat stones, and let them burn down. If you look in Jonah Pike's ledger, you will find the entry for those candles. 2 tallow, paid. The name in the payer column is blank, because some things are better carried between 2 hearts than written for an eye that does not care. If the ledger speaks again, you'll know which page to open first.